PepsiCo just crashed over 4% in a single day. Not because of earnings, not because of supply chains, not because some analysts downgraded them, because 5 states just banned junk food from food stamps. And this isn't about soda. This is about the government deciding what counts as food. For the first time in decades, companies that were supposed to be recession-proof just became regulation-proof. The defensive moats that Wall Street counted on for decades just got breached by bureaucrats, and the market is trying to figure out what that means for everything. Because when the government can reclassify Coca-Cola from food to luxury item overnight, what else can they reclassify? What other industries thought they were safe? What's up, guys? It's Tom here. If you've been following this channel, you know we've been tracking the consumer pullback since early this year. While everyone was focused on the jobs numbers, which we called as overcounted months before the Bureau of Labor Statistics finally admitted their massive error. Something bigger was building underneath the surface. A policy shift that just turned America's biggest food companies from defensive plays into regulatory targets. January 1st, 2026, Indiana, Iowa, Nebraska, Utah, and West Virginia flipped a switch. No more soda on food stamps, no more candy, no more sweetened drinks, no more energy drinks. For the first time since the food stamp program launched, the government drew a hard line and said these aren't food anymore, they're luxury items. And if you're one of the millions of people in those states who depend on SNAP benefits, that's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. What used to be called food stamps, you just lost access to products that used to make up a huge chunk of your grocery cart. Here's what makes this brutal. It's not gradual. It's not a phase out. You went to bed December 31st able to buy a Coke with your benefits. You woke up January 1st and that same Coke became off limits. Same product, same store, same need. Different rules, and Wall Street is scrambling to figure out what this means because nobody saw it coming this fast. Here's what Wall Street is scrambling to figure out. Nobody knows exactly how much revenue Pepsi and Coke get from food stamps. It's not in their earnings reports. They don't break it out by payment method, but industry estimates put sweetened beverages at a massive chunk of all SNAP spending. That's out of a $100 billion program. So we're talking about billions in locked out revenue annually, billions that just vanished on New Year's Day across these states alone. And here's the brutal part. You can't fix this by raising prices or running better marketing campaigns. When someone's paying cash for a Coke because their subsidized food budget got restricted to quote-unquote healthy items, that friction kills the purchase. It's not delayed revenue, it's destroyed volume. Think about it from a consumer behavior standpoint. You're a single mom in Nebraska working 2 part-time jobs. You get a couple $100s a month in SNAP benefits to feed your family. Before January 1st, you could stretch that by buying some filling, calorie-dense items like soda and snacks alongside rice, beans, and whatever protein you could afford. Now, that same budget has to cover only government-approved healthy items, which cost more per calorie. So not only can you not buy the Pepsi, you have less cash left over to buy the Pepsi because your food budget doesn't stretch as far. It's a double hit to volume. The recession risk model I tracked jumped to 67 out of 100. We're officially in pre-recession territory, and part of that move is what happens when you take spending power away from the lowest income consumers, right as the labor market is already falling apart. These aren't the consumers who can absorb a policy shock. These are the marginal spenders who are already getting squeezed. But the revenue hit isn't even the real story here. The real story is what this does to the brand positioning and long-term regulatory trajectory. For decades, tobacco companies didn't just get taxed into oblivion, they got ostracized, legally classified as harmful, banned from advertising during prime time, age-restricted warning labels, sued by state attorneys general, excluded from retirement portfolios. The whole ESG movement basically started with divesting from tobacco. By putting soda in the same category as alcohol and tobacco, things you can't buy with government assistance, these states just started the tobacco-ification of big soda. Think about the psychological shift here. If the government doesn't consider Coca-Cola to be food, what message does that send to parents, to schools, to employers thinking about what to stock in their vending machines? When the federal government subsidizes fruits and vegetables, but explicitly excludes your product, you're not competing on taste and marketing anymore. You're fighting for legitimacy. And legitimacy fights are expensive and unpredictable. The tobacco companies spent decades trying to prove cigarettes weren't harmful. They had studies, scientists, marketing campaigns. None of it worked, because once the government regulatory momentum starts, it feeds on itself. Each restriction enables the next restriction. Each tax hike justifies the next tax hike. PepsiCo's defensive moat, the idea that people always buy soda, recession or not, because it's cheap calories and familiar comfort, just got breached. They thought they were selling an essential consumer staple. The government just reclassified them as selling optional consumer luxuries. And this is just wave 1. Idaho and Colorado are rolling out similar bans next month. Florida's legislature is considering it for their millions of SNAP recipients. Over a dozen other states have submitted waiver applications to the USDA in various stages of approval. If Texas or Florida join this movement, we're not talking about a regional pilot program anymore. We're talking about a national crisis for the beverage industry. Texas alone has millions of people on SNAP. Florida has millions more. You add those two states to the current 5, and you're looking at a massive group of Americans who can no longer buy soda with government benefits. That's not a rounding error in the beverage business. That's a market segment. Meanwhile, the retailers are getting crushed on implementation costs. Walmart, Kroger, Target, they're all looking at massive technology overhauls. Their point-of-sale systems now have to distinguish between Coca-Cola and orange juice in real time at checkout. They need to track which products are SNAP eligible by state, update their systems every time regulations change, and train cashiers to handle the inevitable conflicts when customers don't understand why their transaction got declined. Industry estimates put this technology upgrade at massive costs across major retailers, and here's what's really insidious about those costs. They create an incentive for retailers to deprioritize the restricted products. If you're Walmart and you have to spend extra money to police Coke sales, why not just give that shelf space to something easier to manage? The regulatory compliance costs become a competitive disadvantage for the banned products even among cash-paying customers. The model's forecast is showing this regulatory momentum as the most likely scenario going forward. Not a reversal, not a stall, acceleration. Because politically, this is a free win for state politicians. They get to look tough on corporate welfare and public health without raising taxes or cutting spending. So how does this play out over the next year and a half? My model is tracking 3 distinct paths, and the probability weights shifted dramatically after this week. Path 1 is containment. The restrictions stay limited to these conservative states, plus maybe a couple others. Total affected population stays manageable. Revenue impact remains contained to a small percentage of total sales. PepsiCo and Coke spend the next 2 years reformulating their way back to SNAP eligibility, less sugar, more natural ingredients, whatever bureaucratic boxes they need to check. Stock prices stabilize around current levels. Model gives this the lowest probability. Path 2 is escalation. More states join over the next year. Populous states like Florida, Texas, or Pennsylvania implement bans. The affected population jumps to millions more Americans. Revenue hole becomes a crater. We're talking a significant chunk of total beverage sales locked out. Both companies are forced into massive portfolio pivots, more water brands, sports drinks, healthier snacks, maybe even some food products to diversify away from the regulated categories. Margins suffer during the transition because healthier products cost more to produce and command lower volumes. Stock prices drop significantly from current levels. Model probability, highest path 3, is the nuclear option that breaks everything. Federal adoption, the USDA decides this is such a good idea that they take it national. Suddenly all Americans on SNAP can't buy soda, candy, or sweetened beverages with their benefits. That's not just a beverage industry problem. That's a consumer spending collapse hitting the lowest income demographic right as unemployment is creeping higher. And the broader economy is already showing recession signals. The companies don't just lose revenue, they lose their entire value proposition as recession-resistant investments. Model probability rising fast. So what does this mean for your wallet and your investment strategy? If you're holding consumer staples because you thought they were defensive plays, you just learned that defensive doesn't mean regulation proof. The sector that was supposed to protect your portfolio during recessions now has its own existential regulatory threat that has nothing to do with economic cycles. KO, PUP, Dr. Pepper, Snapple, these stocks used to be the boring, reliable dividend plays that retirees could buy and hold forever. Now they're regulatory risk plays where a bureaucrat in Washington can wake up and decide your investment thesis is illegal. If you're invested in KO or PUP directly, and I know a lot of you are because you've told me in the comments, you're making a bet that this wave stays contained, and these companies can reformulate their way out of the regulatory crosshairs. Maybe they can. Coca-Cola has survived wars, recessions, the new Coke disaster, and changing consumer preferences for well over a century. But the risk-reward calculation is ugly right now. If nothing spreads beyond these 5 states, you might recover the 4% you lost this week and get back to slow, steady dividend growth. If this goes to many more states, you're looking at massive downside. If it goes federal, all bets are off. If you're in broad index funds, which is most of you according to the polls I run, the S&P's consumer staples weighting just became a lot riskier than it was last week. These companies represent a significant chunk of the index weight, and they're not acting like defensive stocks anymore. Your diversified portfolio just became less diversified. And if you're someone who actually relies on SNAP benefits to feed your family, this isn't about stock prices or investment returns. This is about having your choices restricted by politicians and bureaucrats who've never had to stretch a food budget to feed a family for a month. The people making these decisions shop at Whole Foods and drink expensive green juices. They're not the ones dealing with the trade-offs. Look, I get that some people support these restrictions. Childhood obesity is real. Diabetes is real. The public health costs of sugar consumption are massive, and they do fall on taxpayers eventually, but so is food insecurity, so is the stress of trying to make government benefits stretch to the end of the month, and taking choices away from people who already have the fewest choices. That's not policy innovation. That's punishment disguised as public health. When you're working 2 jobs and still need government assistance to eat, you don't need a lecture about optimal nutrition from your state legislature. You need calories you can afford. Bottom line, the government just reclassified soda as a luxury item for over 1 million Americans, with millions more potentially coming. PepsiCo crashed 4% in one day because investors are trying to price in a future where defensive stocks aren't defensive anymore, where regulatory risk can appear overnight without warning, and where the companies they thought were recession-proof might be regulation vulnerable instead. The recession model is reading 67 out of 100 with the labor market weakening, consumer spending under pressure, and now regulatory uncertainty hitting what used to be the safe sectors. I remain defensively positioned, heavy cash allocation, reduced equity exposure, avoiding the sectors that look safe but might not be. It's the same positioning strategy I've held since the model launched, and it's quietly outperformed the S&P while this mess has been unfolding. If you want to track this regulatory risk alongside the other recession indicators I monitor, I built a full dashboard at recessionistpro.com. Real-time updates, probability forecasts, sector-by-sector risk analysis, $20 a month, cancel anytime, the link's in the description. Here's what to watch over the next 90 days, and I'm putting specific dates on this so you can hold me accountable. March 15th is when Idaho and Colorado are expected to announce their final implementation dates for the SNAP restrictions. If both states confirm bans starting in April, PepsiCo retests the December lows, and the recession model adds points for regulatory momentum. Second thing, watch for any federal-level signals. If USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins starts talking about national adoption of these restrictions, or if it comes up in congressional hearings, that's not guidance, that's a warning shot. Consumer staples become the new tobacco, and this drop becomes the beginning of a much bigger repricing. Third, earnings season in April, listen for any mention of SNAP revenue impact on PepsiCo and Coca-Cola calls. If they quantify the hit, the market will immediately extrapolate it to more states. If they refuse to discuss it, that tells you they're scared of the numbers.